right, so we're back, and today we're doing like a really deep dive into this book that I know you guys have all been requesting, The Truth About Feminism, a deconstruction from a man's perspective.
Yeah.
And I know, like, you guys are really interested in seeing how modern feminism is, like, what's its impact on men.
Right.
And, traditional societal structures, especially, as it relates to, like, relationships and marriage.
Definitely a very hot button topic.
Yeah.
And this book, it really kind of goes there.
Oh, yeah.
So I think we should just jump right into it.
Yeah, okay, so like right off the bat, the book kind of gives us like a history of feminism, right? And breaks it down into these like three waves.
Yeah.
And, like we all know about like the first wave, right?
Yeah.
With the suffragettes like fighting for the right to vote.
Right, like seemed pretty reasonable
Yeah.
at the time.
Total.
But the book, it argues that like from those early goals of just basic equality, like feminism kind of went a little radical. Like over time it shifted more towards like acquiring power and maybe at the expense of, men's traditional roles and their influence.
And then, okay, this is where it gets juicy, all right?
Okay.
The book makes this pretty shocking claim about Gloria Steinem.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, one of like the biggest names in feminism, right? It alleges that she was funded by the CIA. Yeah, so like it goes into her involvement with this thing called the Independent Research Service.
Okay.
And like the founding of
the National Organization for Women. I mean, it definitely makes you think, right?
Well,
like, what were the motivations, maybe some of the influences behind these feminist organizations?
Yeah.
If we think back to like the Cold War, there was a lot of like suspicion and anxiety around social movements back then.
Yeah, for sure.
So, I mean, whether or not you buy into this whole CIA theory, it does highlight how important it is to understand like the historical and political context surrounding like how feminism has evolved.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Makes you think about like who's really in control. What's the agenda, right?
Right.
So the book's like central argument is that modern feminism has like basically declared war on traditional masculinity.
Oh, wow.
It's like there's this deliberate effort to redefine and like weaken men's roles in society.
Interesting.
Yeah. So like it backs this up with some like interesting examples, right?
Sure.
So the book talks about like attacks on all male spaces,
Okay.
like fraternities and sports clubs.
Right.
And it argues that this is like an attempt to dismantle traditional like male bonds and their support systems.
Makes you wonder, right?
Totally.
Are these like attacks or these changes?
Right.
Just reflecting like how society is changing,
Yeah.
or is there something more like deeper going on?
Right. Yeah. And then there's like how men are portrayed in media and entertainment these days.
Yeah.
It's like, how often do we see men, depicted as these like incompetent fools,
Right.
or like dangerous creditors?
It's just a pattern.
Yeah.
It's a pattern for sure.
It makes you think like, is there this conscious effort to kind of like undermine men's image and your influence?
It's interesting. The book definitely leans towards like it being deliberate.
Oh, yeah.
Like there's this effort to, emasculate men
Right.
and strip them of their authority.
And it doesn't stop there.
Okay. Right.
It brings up this whole concept of checking your privilege,
Right.
which the book argues is basically a tactic to make men feel guilty for simply being men.
Okay. Yeah.
It creates this like culture of shame and undermines like your confidence.
Now, privilege is a complex thing on the surface. It can feel like an accusation, right?
Right.
But it's really more about like acknowledging that certain groups have like advantages in society. But this book seems to interpret it as like a tool to silence men and make them like question their worth.
Yeah, and this all like ties into the book's discussion of like the wage gap and rape culture, which like are two of the biggest talking points.
Yes, it's huge in like feminist discourse.
Yeah, and the book's like, these are myths.
What?
Yeah, he argues that like they're used to demonize men and paint them as like inherently oppressive.
All right, let's break that down a little bit. When it comes to the wage gap, the book really dives deep into these factors like, career choices, hours worked, time taken off, like for family, to kind of explain like why there's this discrepancy in earning.
Yeah.
It's not about saying there isn't a gap, but it's about like exploring those reasons and asking, is it really just because of discrimination?
Right. And then on the topic of rape culture, the book argues that, this concept just unfairly labels all men as like potential predators,
Yeah.
And it suggests that like this narrative is creating like a climate of fear and mistrust between men and women.
It's such a sensitive issue.
Yeah.
And it's like so emotionally charged.
It is.
But I think the book is just urging like caution in how we talk about this, you know?
Yeah.
Because like painting all men with the same brush can be really harmful and like counterproductive.
Okay, so we've got these like attacks on masculinity, you know, these alleged myths being used to kind of like demonize men.
Right.
And then the book dives into like, what's the impact of all this on relationships and family structures?
Okay, yeah.
And it's not pretty.
What does it say?
Well, it argues that, you know, feminism has actually led to an increase in divorce rates and that these divorces are like primarily initiated by women. Yeah. And it suggests that like the movement has created this like sense of resentment and distrust towards men, which obviously makes it really hard to have like healthy relationships.
Right.
The book even blames the decline of marriage and the rise of single motherhood on feminism's like negative impact on the traditional family unit.
And it links all of this back to this idea of a covert contract within marriage.
Yeah.
Now, if you're familiar with like the red pill philosophy, this will like totally resonate with you. The book is basically arguing that modern feminism like disrupted this traditional balance of power, you know, within a marriage, which makes it like way harder for men to like fulfill their roles as providers and protectors, while like at the same time women are being encouraged to, you know, prioritize their individual needs.
It's like making me rethink everything I thought I knew about relationships.
I know, right? It's a lot.
So before we get too deep to that, let's switch gears a little bit.
Okay.
And talk about education.
Okay.
Because the book argues that feminism has also created a hostile environment for boys in schools.
Interesting. Okay.
And I want to hear more about that.
Yeah, let's hear it. What does it say?
Okay, so it highlights how common like gender studies programs are and these safe spaces on campuses, which it claims like often promote like a very specific feminist ideology and like shut down any dissenting opinion, especially from men.
Especially from men. It's like they're not allowed to have a different opinion.
Right. And it also argues that like traditional masculine traits, like competitiveness, assertiveness, are being like demonized or pathologized within like the education system.
So instead of like encouraging boys to embrace those qualities, they're being told that it's toxic.
Yeah, basically.
Wow, that's wild.
Yeah, and then like to add insult to injury, the book points to this emphasis on like female role model in education, you know, and it suggests that this is sending like this implicit message that like male achievements and perspectives are just like less valuable.
So it's not just like relationships and family that are under attack, but like the very foundation of how boys are being, you know, educated.
Yeah, this is like heavy stuff.
This is heavy stuff. Yeah. The book is laying out like a pretty provocative case here. I think like before we get into the author's like proposed solutions for all this, you know, for men, let's just like take a moment. Let all of this sink in.
Yeah, good idea.
Yeah. So, you know, we just laid out like some pretty serious critiques of modern feminism based on this book, The Truth About Feminism, right? Now I think we should like explore what the author thinks men should do about it.
Yeah, because like it can feel kind of overwhelming, right?
Oh, totally.
To hear about all these societal shifts and like feel powerless.
Right.
So like what's the plan?
Well, the book lays out this whole thing called A Strategy for Men.
Okay.
And it's all about like reclaiming power and agency in a world that honestly seems like it's like increasingly hostile towards traditional masculinity.
Okay, I'm listening. Tell me more about this strategy.
Well, the first step, according to the book, is understanding like the true nature of modern feminism.
Okay.
He's arguing that, you know, it's gone way beyond just advocating for equality and has become more about like acquiring power and control, often at the expense of men.
So it's not about like leveling the playing field anymore.
Right.
It's about tilting it in the other direction.
That's the argument. Yeah.
Wow.
And the book, it really encourages men to like be critical of those mainstream feminist narratives and to, you know, seek out different perspectives that challenge those narratives. You know, it's like if you're going to fight back against something, you got to know what you're up against.
Exactly. So what's the next step then?
Okay, so the second part is all about reclaiming those traditional masculine values and roles.
Okay.
The book argues that, like, men have been conditioned to be ashamed of their masculinity, and that it's time to, like, embrace the qualities that are inherently male.
Okay, like what?
You know, things like strength, assertiveness, courage, leadership.
So this is where that red pill philosophy comes in again, right?
Exactly.
Like understanding how men and women are fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And how those differences like play out in relationships and society.
Exactly. The book is basically saying that, like, men need to rediscover their, like, masculine core and stop apologizing for who they are.
Yeah.
It's rejecting that whole idea that traditional masculinity is toxic and instead embracing the qualities that make men strong and capable leaders.
And I'm seeing how this ties back into that like covert contract thing, right?
Yes.
Within marriage.
Exactly.
Like if men are being told to suppress their masculinity, it makes it harder for them to like fulfill those traditional roles in the relationship.
The book suggests that, like, by reclaiming their masculinity, men can regain that sense of purpose and confidence, which can, you know, lead to stronger relationships and a more fulfilling life overall.
Okay, so understand the enemy, right? And reclaim your masculine core.
Yeah.
What's the last piece of this strategy?
All right, so this is where it gets, you know, a little controversial.
Okay.
The author calls on men to, like, actively resist the feminist narrative.
So, like, speak out against it.
Yeah, speak out against feminist ideas and policies that they believe are harmful.
Okay.
And to, like, refuse to be silenced or shamed for having a different perspective.
So it's not just about understanding and reclaiming.
Right.
But, like, actually pushing back
Yeah.
against what they see as, like, the negative influence of feminism.
Exactly. It's about taking a stand.
Okay.
And, like, fighting for what they believe in.
Okay.
The book encourages men to be, like, vocal advocates for men's rights and to challenge that feminist agenda wherever they see it.
It sounds, I don't know, kind of bold.
It is bold.
Yeah.
But, like, doesn't that risk creating, you know, even more conflict and division between men and women?
Yeah, exactly.
That's a valid concern.
Yeah.
And the book does acknowledge that.
Okay.
But it argues that the stakes are just too high to just sit back and be passive.
Okay.
You know, the author believes that if men don't fight back, feminism is going to continue to, like, erode traditional values and institutions.
Yeah.
And that will lead to, like, a decline in Western civilization.
So it's a call to action, like a battle cry almost.
Pretty much.
He's like urging men to, you know, wake up, man up, and reclaim their rightful place in society.
The book uses, like, some pretty strong language,
Yeah.
you know, talking about fighting back, resisting, reclaiming,
Yeah.
even comparing it to, like, a war.
Wow.
It's meant to, like, inspire men to take action and stand up for what they believe in.
This fight back strategy, it's definitely making me think, but it also raises some questions for me.
Like what?
Like, what does this resistance actually look like?
Right.
You know, in practice.
Yeah.
And like, how can men, you know, engage in this battle without resorting to like anger and aggression?
Those are great questions.
Yeah.
And those are questions that, like, the book goes into in more detail. So I think we should explore those nuances in the next part of our deep dive.
Yeah, let's do it.
Where we unpack the specific tactics and strategies, you know, that the author recommends for men who want to resist the feminist agenda and reclaim their masculine power.
This is getting really interesting. I can't wait to hear more about how this all like plays out.
Me too.
All right, so we're back and we're ready to like wrap up our deep dive into the truth about feminism.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride.
We've like covered so much.
Yeah, we really have.
From the history of the movement to like how it's impacting men today. And we even got into like that fight back strategy.
It's definitely a controversial perspective.
Yeah, for sure.
But, you know, I think it's important to, like, step back now and think about what this all means for you guys.
Right.
You know, especially if you're trying to understand and maybe even, like, change the covert contracts in your own lives.
Because at the end of the day, like, knowledge is power.
Exactly.
Right. And we want you guys to walk away from this, like, feeling empowered to make, you know, good decisions.
Informed decisions.
Yeah, informed decisions.
About your relationships and your role in, like, society.
Okay, so let's distill some, like, key takeaways from the truth about feminism.
Yeah.
And kind of, like, leave you guys with some things to think about.
I like it.
So first and foremost, like, this book is really encouraging men to question, like, the mainstream narrative surrounding feminism.
Right. It's like, don't just accept what you hear.
Yeah, exactly.
No, dig a little deeper.
Yeah.
Think critically.
It's challenging that whole idea that, like, it's all about equality.
Yeah. It suggests there might be, like a hidden agenda.
Yeah, exactly. And that agenda is focused on, like,
Power and control.
Power and control. Yeah.
And I think it's just a good reminder that, like, there are always multiple sides to any story.
Yeah.
And it's super important to, like, evaluate the info you're being given.
Especially with something as, like, sensitive.
Yeah, emotionally charged.
Emotionally charged.
Gender and power dynamics.
Totally. The book also, like, really emphasizes the importance of
Yeah.
reclaiming, like, those traditional masculine values and roles.
You were talking about before.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Arguing that men have been, like, conditioned to suppress their natural instinct. And it's time to embrace, like, what makes them strong.
Right. Their strength, leadership.
Yeah, their leadership qualities.
All those good things.
And this all ties back to, like, that concept of the covert contract.
Yes, exactly.
In a marriage, which we were talking about earlier.
Yeah, and the book is suggesting that by, like, understanding and fulfilling those roles, men can actually create more stable and fulfilling relationships.
Yeah, for sure. And then finally, like, the book calls on men to, like, actively resist what it sees as, like, the harmful influence of modern feminism.
Call to action.
Yeah. It's like, wake up, guys.
Speak up, fight back.
Yeah. Don't be silenced.
And it's definitely controversial.
It is.
But it does highlight how important it is to, like, engage in these conversations and stand up for what you believe in.
Even when it's hard.
Even when it's hard, yeah.
Yeah. So where do we go from here?
Good question.
We've, like, unpacked so much.
Yeah, a lot of information.
What are, like, some practical things our listeners can do to, like, apply all this?
Well, the book provides, like, a really great framework for understanding, the challenges that men are facing today in a society that's, becoming increasingly influenced by, like, feminist ideology.
Right, and it encourages men to, like, be more aware of those covert contracts,
Absolutely.
that are operating in their relationship.
And to renegotiate them.
Yeah, negotiate those contracts.
In a way that, like, brings more balance and fulfillment.
So for those of you in the red pill community,
Yeah.
this might mean, like, having those really open and honest conversations with your partner.
Communication is key.
Yeah.
Communication is key.
About your needs
Yeah.
and expectations.
Yeah.
What you want, what you need.
Exactly. It's about, like, moving away from that dynamic where men feel pressured to, like, constantly suppress their masculinity.
Right, and towards a more, like, equal partnership.
Yeah.
Where both people feel respected and valued.
Who they are.
Exactly. It's about creating a new kind of covert contract.
I love that.
Yeah.
New covert contract.
One that's based on, understanding and a shared vision for the future.
So it's not about, like, battling with your partner.
No, not at all.
It's about, like, working together.
Yeah, teamwork.
Yeah.
To create something better.
To create a more, like, harmonious dynamic.
Right, and remember, this is a journey.
Yeah.
It takes time, it takes patience.
Process.
It takes, a commitment to personal growth.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
Well, I think this deep dive has given us, like, a lot to think about.
For sure.
If any of these ideas resonated with you and you're, like, interested in learning more, definitely check out the book.
Yeah, go check out The Truth About Feminism, Instruction from a Man's Perspective.
You can find it on Amazon Kindle.
Yeah, Amazon Kindle and Google Play Books.
And as you continue to, like, explore these concepts, remember that the most important thing is to find what works for you and your relationship.
There's no one-size-fits-all approach here.
Exactly.
But by becoming more aware of, like, the forces at play, you can make better choices that will empower you to, create a life that aligns with your values and your goal.
I love it.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Yeah, this was great.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep striving to create, like, the relationship and the life you deserve.
Couldn't agree more.